Hi, everyone. I'm Wansi. Thanks so much for having me here today to share a little bit about what we are doing in AI governance in IMDA. What I will cover today is maybe in two parts. One is a little bit of context setting in terms of, where we are in the world of AI, in terms of adoption and some of the concerns that organizations are facing. Then two, then what are we doing in Singapore to try and address these concerns or these risks. I won't cover the breadth of our work, but highlighted some areas in which we're making some efforts in, right? So, yeah, here we go. Feel free to, I think there was like a QR code just now, so feel free to ask questions, and I think just make this a little bit more interactive if you like, and my presentation may take about 15 minutes. I'll move through some of the slides quite quickly, so if there are any questions, let me know and I'll take them at the end. Yeah, thanks. So in terms of context setting, I know it's really hard to see because all the words are quite tiny, but you can look up this report from McKinsey, but it's really about how I think organizations are increasingly using AI, especially right with the introduction of Gen AI last year, and both to address their top line revenue concerns. That means how do they drive revenue increases due to AI, as well as to manage the bottom line in terms of addressing the cost of operations of business, right, using AI. So businesses, I mean, from my own experience, suddenly there's been a lot of interest, partly also because Gen AI for a lot of organizations is sort of an easy entry into AI in terms of identifying how they're going to advance their business interests, right? And for those who are using Gen AI, most of them are actually looking at internal-facing use cases. On this chart, there are some of the various ways in which organizations are addressing their needs through AI, text summarization, customer service, and so on. And a lot of it is, majority of it is internal-facing, right, today. And the reason for that is because there are still many concerns about whether large language models or Gen AI can actually effectively meet their needs, but also whether they can address some of these risks that are inherent in the use of LLMs, right? So I'll just have a couple of examples on the chart here. One example is a very recent one from Air Canada. They have a chatbot dealing with customers, right? And then there was a question from a customer that says, oh, will I get a refund? Or I don't have I can't remember the specific details, but something along getting a refund for a particular situation, right? The chatbot says, yes, you can, if you do it this way and that way, right? But turned out that actually that's against Air Canada's policy. And when Air Canada refused to fulfill, right, that refund, they were taken to court, and then they were made to honor the refund policy. So this is one example of how it's important to figure out how you use these technologies effectively. It's very good at engaging customers, but you also need to make sure that you deal with the fact that these LLMs can hallucinate, right? If you can hallucinate means they'll actually make stuff up, right? Because that's inherent to how these models work, right? So how then do you address these hallucination issues, right? At the same time, there are other issues around, leaking of sensitive information, around copyright concerns on how potentially your output can be very similar to copyrighted material because of how the models have been trained. They ingest a lot of potentially copyrighted content, and if the output is very similar, then will you run into copyright issues downstream, right, as a user, right? The model developers, of course, have to deal with upstream problems around what data they use for training, but as a user, you will have to worry about what the output, right, that you have actually used a prompt to generate. And as I already mentioned, what if your employees are using it and then leaking some of your internal sensitive content to the models as well. Besides that, there are also some concerns around, deeper issues around potential harms that these can generate. So number one, especially among many people, is how it can introduce, or AI can introduce bias in decisions that are made about individuals, right? Not just in, well, this has already started to appear in what we call the traditional AI space, but in Gen AI as well. So if there's discrimination, this can result in some severe outcomes for individuals, and eventually, if this comes to light, then it will actually impact organizations' brand as well. I mean, brand, besides regulations, brand reputation is probably one of the main drivers of how organizations are thinking about making sure they address some of these AI risks, right? So in order to deal with all of these, companies are increasingly adopting responsible AI measures, right? But at the same time, if you look at the second chart, they also acknowledge that their level of preparedness for generative AI, for putting in place, managing the risk in Gen AI is quite low. So they need help, right? And how then do we get to offer this help? I was having dinner with one of my friends recently. He's from a big bank, right? Not even SMEs, big bank, global bank, not a local bank, global bank. And then he was saying, yeah, they invest a lot in responsible AI measures, but at the end of the day, what exactly will they do? It's not clear yet. And this is from organizations that have the resources to invest, right? So they need some clarity in terms of where should they be, what risk should they be mitigating, and how should they be doing it, right? So that's one, organizations concerned around addressing risk in AI. Two, the consumers are also starting to be much more aware about AI risks. So yesterday there was a forum letter where somebody wrote and say, look, you know, large language models, when I put in my name, I might actually get rubbish about me being generated from the model. So they're starting to get concerned about this, and then they're asking, so what is the government doing about it, right? So as the government, we have to figure it out. But some of these things are really about how then do we deal with consumer education, how then do we deal with making sure organizations put in place the right practices. So 2, how do we address consumers' concerns? 3, increasingly, I think governments around the world are also starting to put in place regulations. We have the UI Act that has been in discussion for actually a few years now, finally passed, and it's one of the first, wide-ranging regulations around AI, right? Of course, China has been doing it since last year or a couple of years ago, but very much internally focused. But the EU one will actually impact a lot of companies who want to deliver products and services to the EU, or who are delivering products and services that will impact EU citizens, right? And then US also started to look at what they need to do. A lot of it is in the wake of increasing concerns around generative AI. And last year, Biden passed an executive order to say these are the things that US needs to do to address AI harms. So there's a lot of governments responding, and these will not be the only ones. Increasingly, we are starting to see more and more regulations coming from government. Canada has the Data and AI Act already. Not much details in there yet, but it's already passed something, and others will follow, right? So how then do we make sure that companies can meet these requirements from different markets? How then do we make sure that companies, especially our companies in Singapore, are able to continue to deliver their services outside of Singapore before this fragmentation in terms of how governments are thinking about AI requirements in their regulations? So what are we doing in Singapore? The first thing is we believe that we shouldn't just be looking at addressing risk from just addressing risk perspective. We look at it quite holistically. So the National AI Strategy from last year in December, that's a National AI Strategy 2.0 that was published, talked about how AI can be used for public good, and then what are the ways in which you want to then drive that public good work in AI, right? And one of the components is really about building a trusted ecosystem or a trusted environment for AI. And for us, that really means, number one, putting in place the guardrails, but also really the guardrails is meant to protect consumers, but also then making sure we have enough space for organizations or companies to continue to innovate with AI. So both the use as well as the protection, and driving this concurrently then hopefully creates a virtuous cycle. One, consumers will trust the AI systems or use more. Then 2, that then creates more space, hopefully for companies to be able to continue to deliver innovative solutions using AI, right? So that's one, right? Building that trusted AI ecosystem. Number 2, how then do we then support this work, given that AI capability is moving so fast? This is something like every other week, actually maybe every week, there's some new developments in this space. It's been happening in this crazy pace since last year, right? And it's exponentially growing in terms of the development. But yet the state of science for AI governance is behind. So how then do we make sure that we work together, not just with local organizations and enterprises, but also internationally? We need to partner with other governments, with academia, with industry, to be able to move the needle, at least in governance space. At the same time, for Singapore, it also means we have to be very adaptive, very agile, very practical how we handle these governance policies and tools that we put in place, so that we can continue to evolve them as the technology evolves. And And if you've been following the news, just this week, there's a big conversation in Seoul called the AI Safety Summit in Seoul that follows from Bletchley Park last year in UK, where they talk about how governments can work together, how internationally we can work together. So we also want to make sure that the work we do contributes to global development in terms of norms as well as knowledge. So what have we done in this space and where are we going, right? So I'll just give you some examples of the work that we've done. Sorry, the slide is, again, very small words. We should think about fixing this. But we started in 2019, 2020 with some guidelines, right? One of the very early ones to take ethical AI considerations from just principles. Everybody was just talking about, oh, you must be fair, you must be transparent, you must be explainable. What we did was we took that into very, very specific guidelines what companies need to think about. Like, for example, setting up, a risk committee, thinking about how do they deal with data and so on. So these were published back in 2019, 2020. They're still very much relevant today, even though a lot of it is focused on traditional AI kind of concerns, right? Then following that, then we started asking ourselves, how then do we make it practical, right, for companies to demonstrate that they have met these requirements? And that's where we developed the AI Verify tool. It's a technical, it's a toolkit that is both a technical testing toolkit as well as a set of processes that you can check to make sure that you're aligned to globally accepted principles around AI. We were anticipating that we need to start building up this capacity, both in the government as well as in the industry, on how to meet eventually compliance requirements from regulations. So we're starting to say, hey, we better start putting in place tools for people to demonstrate, so they understand how do they do these things if they're asked to comply to regulatory requirements. So that's where that was at the back of my mind when we came out very Verify. And then we open sourced it last year, and then we set up a foundation to help with the open source work. And then and last year, of course, GenAI came to be widely accepted by the public or widely used, and that's where we start looking at then how do we translate our work into GenAI policies, and I'll talk a bit about them later, but we already started thinking about what are the risks, how do we address these risks, where do we want to focus our energies right at the beginning, and then so on. So I'll get into that a little bit later. So really for Singapore, I mean, because before this we talked about regulations in EU, regulations in China, but for Singapore it is really about, number one, supporting industry voluntary adoption of these measures. But we have existing regulations, so we're not really operating a regulatory vacuum. We have regulations in healthcare, finance, we have regulations in online safety, and data protection and so on. This will help to, and these are technology agnostic, and this will help to at least address some of this risk that we see that's coming up. So what should companies do, right? All these things that we put out is really to support companies in terms of how they implement responsible AI properly, right? So first, you can look at the governance framework. These are some measures that you can think about. But secondly, you can also look at some of the domain-specific requirements that have been published. The PDPC has published an advisory guideline on how do you interpret the PDPA in the context of AI, right? Especially around AI recommendation and decision systems. MOH has already published, I think a couple of years ago already, the AI in healthcare guidelines, and then in MAS as well, quite a lot of advisory guidelines for the financial services sector. So these are things that, first, look at the governance framework that gives you some idea of what you need to do within your organization. Two, look at if your domain falls into this area, think about how these will apply to you. Next, you can also then consider how do you use AI Verify as a tool to assess your governance framework and your systems, right? AI Verify, as I mentioned, is a toolkit that allows you to do some process checks. There's something like 90 over process checks. We've mapped it to the NIST, which is the National Institute of Science and Technology. That's the sort of like the technical and standards agency in US. We've mapped it to NIST AI risk management framework. Why we map it? Because, look, everybody listens to NIST, nobody will think about Singapore, but so we have to make sure that we are sort of aligned and interoperable. Then two, besides the process checks, we have also then looked at how then do we actually help companies do testing, right? So it's a simple toolkit. We looked at what's out there in terms of testing algorithms around the world in open source, in academia. We put it together into a product that can be downloaded from GitHub, installed into the company's own environment, and then they run through these processes for fairness, explainability, and robustness. And for now, because of the testing algorithms, it only applies to certain types of AI models like supervised learning. It doesn't address maybe images, mostly tabular data, but that's why we started a foundation to help us continue to improve this toolkit in an open source way. Right? So we've got interesting companies who have started using this, from Singapore Airlines to Zopa to Dell and so on. It's available. Their stories are available on the AI Verify Foundation website. But really, if you look at some of the examples they've given, number one, the process search help them sort of give them a starting point to think about how they go about implementing these requirements. Then two, the toolkit then allows them to do a little bit of testing for some kind of quantifiable results that they can then show in a nice report to people. Right, so that's on AI Verify. But at the same time, you know, almost nobody talks about traditional AI anymore, even though I think it's still very important, right? Everybody's starting to ask us, so how are you going to test for, how are you going to think about Gen AI? So we're starting to think about how we can help organizations or companies address Gen AI, and looking at many different dimensions, right? Number one, because it's gotten a lot more complicated. Number one, along the life cycle of AI development, right? Who is accountable for what, right? So these are some things that we have to start worrying about. Model developers who actually provide these large models and then train them, to application deployers who take these models, add on some kind of harnesses as well as other capabilities to address some concerns, and then to end users who will put in the prompts to get the output, right? So who is responsible for what when the AI model does something terrible, right? So these are things that we have to think about from an accountability perspective. From a trusted development perspective, how do we think about more transparency along this life cycle? Is it some kind of nutrition label so that people understand the limitations of these AI models? Large model developers have already started to publish a lot of system cards, model cards, and so on. How do we make this into something that's easy for downstream users, such as app developers, understand, and so that they can start putting in place the scaffolding, for example, to address some of the risks that the model developers haven't dealt with, right? And then content provenance, I spoke a little bit about copyright, but this content provenance is really about dealing with how do we address knowing which content is from AI, which content is not fake, for example, mostly dealing with the issues around misinfo, disinfo around AI. So there are ways in which we need to address, again, through transparency, how the content is generated. So those three dimensions and others are in the Model Governance Framework for Gen AI. It was published, we published a draft in January for feedback, comments. We've gotten quite a lot of good feedback, more than 70 over from around the world. We are going to next week launch the final version. Yeah, so, but you can look at all the different dimensions from, you know, data to, you know, at the end of the day, how do we make sure that we continue to remember that AI is for public good, and what are the measures that we have to put in place, such as worrying about jobs and the environment. So specifically, because we have focused a lot of work in our traditional AI space on testing, we'll continue to do quite a lot of work in the testing space. And this actually is, I mean, the conversations this week have been really interesting because we are not the only ones who start to talk about evaluation really. I mean, we've been speaking about evaluation for 2 years, and now everybody is talking about evaluation. So that's sort of heartening. But again, the pace is developing so quickly, we have to make sure that we continue to be relevant, continue to contribute to these global developments. So one of the things we did last year was, which nobody actually did, was to come up with an explanation to regular developers, not your big model labs, but really everybody else, on how you think about evaluating large language models. Because all this capability doesn't reside outside, right? So how then do we make that, information available to general audience, right? So we came up with a taxonomy and catalog called for Gen AI testing, where we explain how do you do Gen AI testing, what are the key methods today, and then where are some of these benchmarks that you can use to do testing with, right? And then we catalog them with a taxonomy. And then we identify areas where we continue to need to develop, as well as hopefully some minimum safety requirements that companies need to think about. So that was work that we did in October. And moving forward, we will then build out the tool. One of the things we say is, in that work, is we need to have a standardized tool to support testing. So we are building out the tool to address these things that I have on the slide. Number one, how do you do benchmarking? Number two, then how do you do rate teaming? So benchmarks are essentially exam questions that you put to the models, right? And then you get a response. But benchmarks are inherently, while they're inherently useful, they're also problematic today, right? If you're from academia, you know how to set exam questions, but how do you know that these exam questions actually test for the capability, right? So these are questions we're asking ourselves as well. But that's just one problem. Another problem is it's very hard to use existing benchmarks. People do it in any way they want. It's very hard to pull them into a harness that's useful for us to then connect to models, different models, to do testing. So we're trying to figure out how then do we do this easily for the industry, right? Then two, another way is to rate teaming, and rate teaming is really adversary testing a model, but then how then do we make sure that you can do rate teaming properly and at scale? So to address these technical questions, we are we have developed a tool called Project Moonshot. It's currently in alpha testing, and it's trying to make testing more scalable. It's trying to help organizations think about how they can create benchmark, and then finally how to do red teaming more easily. So it's still in sort of like a minimum viable product stage. We are getting feedback from some partners, but again, it will be open source and as a baseline for people to help to then start to think about how do they contribute, how do they improve it. And to do that, we're also trying to understand where the issues are in industry with regards to Gen AI testing. So we started a sandbox last year to invite industry to work with us so that we understand where the requirements are. Because context-specific, use case-specific testing actually very, very rarely exists today. Then how do we learn from real examples so that this can be propagated to the wider industry and the wider audience, right? So one example is of a project that we're doing is with Anthropic. We're doing a multicultural, multilingual red teaming project. Actually, it's completed already. The idea is eventually to develop a red teaming methodology specifically for the context of languages and culture. And it's actually, for some reason, very popular when we talk to people, right? So everybody's doing a lot of capability testing. But a lot of countries around the world, especially if their main language is not English, are asking themselves, how do they make sure the models are aligned to their culture and their languages? So we want to then take the Anthropic work and make it into more of a general methodology that's useful. Then maybe, hopefully, people can think about developing benchmarks. Almost to the end of my presentation already. Beyond this work that we're doing domestically, we also then need to make sure that we work actively internationally. So we're trying to build a lot of consensus around norms, around how do you go about regulating or putting in place requirements for AI safety and trust. And the way we do it is any platform that is available, we try and help to pull together. ASEAN is one of them, so we publish a guide with our ASEAN colleagues on AI governance and ethics, so that there's some consistent way to think about governance within ASEAN. Two, we're working with the Forum of Small States. There's a digital now because the issues of digital are coming to fore, and working with them to develop an AI governance playbook for small states. Our safety institutes, which is we just designated the Digital Trust Center NTU as our AI Safety Institute. We're also making sure that they work together with the other AI Safety Institutes around the world to advance R&D in AI safety and testing. And then, of course, we participate in all these platforms to push Singapore's requirements, Singapore's interests at these various platforms, as well as provide a little bit more diverse perspective. Because a lot of these places, OECD, GPA, for example. I mean, the UN ones are probably a bit more open to everyone, but some of these are really just limited to countries that are actually very advanced in the use of AI. But we want to then say that actually, besides these requirements, we can also represent what we need here in our region, in ASEAN. That's on the one side, building consensus. On the other side, then, is also how do we make sure that as we dock with individual countries, we continue to be able to interoperate. So US NIST is one that we've already mentioned. We're looking at international standards bodies also to make sure that we can interoperate, and other bilateral collaborations with other countries, because we've signed these digital economy agreements, this sort of digital FTAs with some of these countries, and we're using that as a platform to address. One is AI governance requirements. Of course, there are many other things as well, but that's a good way in which we can start to talk about AI governance interoperability. So example of the ASEAN Guide, what are some of the things that is covered? We have some recommended principles, what organizations can do. A lot of it is very similar to the model governance framework. Since we led the work, so we will, of course, put a lot of the existing work that we have into the guide. But it has gone through that gauntlet of getting feedback from all the ASEAN countries, so it's helpful that at least there's some consensus in how we think about these issues. And then finally, AI Welfare Foundation is a platform in which organizations can participate. So we have global, but I mean G2G level, but this is actually a B2B kind of platform where organizations can work together to both advance the toolkits that we're putting in out there in open source, but also to share experiences, and increasingly we are using this as a mechanism to seek feedback on some of the things we want to do in our policies, and how then do we improve our tools and guidelines that we put out there. And that's all. Thank you very much, and I'll take questions.
Okay, I am here to facilitate that. Okay, I didn't get any questions from the QR code, so I'm going to open to the floor, and I see one very persistent.
There's one over there, so.
Okay, maybe.
Thank you, IC, for the presentation. So I was just wondering, one of the points that you mentioned really resonated with me, which is that governance tends to be playing catch-up with the technology. So I was just wondering whether the government has any teams actually looking into the future of AI and that we anticipate what might actually be going on so that we can take a more proactive approach.
I think there are many parts of Singapore doing AI. It's both on the development side as well as the governance side, right? So for example, AI Singapore is one big outfit that we fund from a research perspective in terms of looking at, what's next, the next bound for AI. So definitely, but I think the point that I was trying to make is it's not, even for all the efforts that we have here in Singapore, it's still not enough, right? So it's really important that we plug in globally and then connect with, at various tiers, right? Research, government, businesses, to try and then hopefully collectively move this forward together from a governance perspective, actually, because development, you run as fast as anybody, as the companies will run them. And as well as then develop useful, practical things that people can use, organizations can use. Yeah.
Okay, second question.
Thank you for the presentation. I just want to ask a question on the AI ecosystem. You mentioned that it's important to have a trusted environment. So I just want to ask you to comment on, who are the players in this ecosystem, and whether the system or regulators do actually any certification of the players in this environment. I just give you a very simple example. Earlier on, we have a session. One of the questions is how do SME, small companies, start? And a common advice is get a consultant.
No.
So the question is, how do we as SME bosses or whatever, know the credibility of these consultants and the system they provide?
Yeah. No, that's a very good question, actually. We got quite a lot of requests from the industry to say, hey, can we do certification? Certification is one mechanism that you can demonstrate, right? Certain ability to achieve certain standards and certain requirements without having us to then say, oh, you must meet these regulatory requirements, right? So certification is one way in which organizations who voluntarily want to go through that can demonstrate. We are starting to see there's pockets of development in certification. We are thinking about it, whether it's something we want to do in Singapore. But in ISO, for example, there's already starting a lot of work in defining AI standards. And as we all know, ISO would be one way in which people will start to use as a benchmark for certification. So to answer your question very simply, say, akan datang, something that we are thinking about and figuring out. But there are starting to be activity in this space around the world. And a lot of third-party testing organizations like Tutsu, Deloitte, all these third-party audit and testing companies are starting to say, hey, can I help you demonstrate your compliance, or that you demonstrate that you actually implemented your AI in the proper way, right? So in a responsible way. So that's also happening. For SMEs, I think you can organize SMEs hopefully into two parts. Number one, the kind of groups of SMEs who basically say, I don't have the resources. I don't think they should go out and talk to a consultant actually for a start, right? They should start think a lot of how we are helping SMEs adopt AI is actually through the solutions that they can use already. So we're helping to look at SME solutions, our SME Go Digital program, approve solutions for SMEs, and we're starting to look at how we can make sure that a lot of these solutions start to embed AI capabilities in there. So SME just need to buy, adopt, and use, right? And maybe a little bit of maybe improving the data, enhancing it and so on, or cleaning them up, but ultimately we're trying to make it as simple as possible. Recently, somebody asked me, can we give a simple guide? All these things that we put out, right? Like many pages of words that SMEs need to read. Maybe it's very hard for them to spend time going through all this and figuring out what it means for them. So we said, okay, maybe we can think about that. Maybe a simple, to-do for SMEs if they want to think about responsible AI implementation. Just as I mentioned, right, that somebody wrote in the forum page, but why this model generates falsehoods about me, but actually the model behaves that way. So it's important to help everyone understand what the technology is, what are its limitations, and how do they use it in a way that's effective and responsible. So I think there are various things that we are looking at from various areas. And for SME, it's both a product perspective, but also maybe a little bit more support from understanding perspective. Yeah.
Okay, finally I got some questions appearing in my iPad, but in the interest of time, I will only choose one question. Here, how do you enforce compliance to the AI standards that you set?
I don't enforce, I can't enforce. I don't have a law to say you must meet, right? But I mean, that's don't mean to be facetious about that, but I mean, to be honest, I can't, right? But we have existing regulations and we ensure that from an outcome perspective, you meet those requirements. So that's one. Two, I think what we are trying to appeal to organizations is you are using AI, you will need to do it properly anyway, because you will need to make sure that you build trust with your customers. You need to make sure that it does not affect your brand if something happens, right? You need to, and that hopefully are enough drivers. But I'll tell you upfront that I think regulation is always a good driver, but I think in Singapore, we are never starting to think of regulation as a mechanism by default, because I think it's a useful tool. As a government, it's always a useful tool, but it's also a very blunt tool, right? I mean, we talk about SMEs. If I impose requirements, the big companies usually have more than enough capability and resources to address these requirements. But what about the small ones? How then do we make sure that when we put in place these requirements, it can address everybody's needs and everyone can comply without too much additional cost? And that's why I think we are looking at other capabilities that we help to build. And hopefully you are motivated by other drivers, whether it's through ESG, your board asking you for things, or maybe just in terms of making sure that you have customers who trust you, then to put in place these mechanisms. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Wan Xie. And let's give a round of applause. Yeah.